Madam Jessica woke up in a pool of her own blood. The thick, metallic scent hung in the air, invading her nostrils as the cold, wet stickiness soaked through her down. She blinked, her mind foggy with confusion and pain. Her first instinct was to sit up, but the agony that shot through her abdomen forced her to freeze. Slowly, she moved her trembling hand to her stomach, feeling the slick warmth of fresh blood beneath her fingers. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Mary. The name cut through her pain like a jagged shard of glass. A dull ache in her heart accompanied the memory of the young woman she had taken into her home, the one she had cared for like the daughter she never had. How could this have happened? The events of the last few hours began to blur together. The betrayal, the confrontation, the violence. Mary and her boyfriend, Femi. They had planned this, had waited for the right moment to strike. And now, Madam Jessica lay here, bleeding and broken, the victim of their greed. The house was eerily quiet, the once warm and inviting mansion now cold and foreign, like a tomb. The darkness pressed in on her, but she had no strength to move. As she lay there, helpless and bleeding, fragments of the past year with Mary began to play in her mind. Mary had come into her life when she needed help the most. After a health scare had prompted her doctor to advise her to slow down and eat healthier, Madam Jessica realized she couldn't keep up with everything on her own. The cleaner at her office had recommended Mary, and after their first meeting, Jessica had taken a liking to the young woman. Mary was quiet but efficient, her eyes wide with gratitude when Madam Jessica offered her the job. In the months that followed, Mary proved herself to be more than just helpful. She kept the house spotless, ran errands without complaint, and even cooked the healthy meals Jessica's doctor had recommended. Madam Jessica, a well-read, well-traveled woman in her 50s who lived alone in her sprawling mansion, had never felt the need for close companionship. But Mary's presence began to fill a void she didn't realize she had. Jessica had been generous to her. One day, she called Mary into her room and handed her a large bag filled with designer clothes she no longer wore. "Take these," she had said with a smile. "They're too good to just sit in my closet. You'll look great in them." Mary's eyes had lit up with joy, her gratitude almost palpable. Another time, when Mary mentioned that her family in the village needed money for hospital bills, Madam Jessica had quietly handed her an envelope with enough to cover the expenses. "If you ever want to go back to school, I'll help you with that too," she had said. She had meant it. Madam Jessica had begun to see Mary as family, even considering sending her to school to get an education if she wished. She had trusted her, cared for her. Perhaps it was because of the loneliness that had crept in after her divorce. Years ago, she had been married, but her husband's infidelity and emotional abuse had driven her away. The betrayal had cut deep, but she had rebuilt her life, focusing on her career and her only child, a son who now worked in another state for a multinational corporation. He visited her when he could, but his job kept him busy, and most of the time, she lived alone in the vast house that had once been a home. Mary had an unassuming demeanor, always quiet and polite, with large, grateful eyes that seemed to appreciate every gesture of kindness. Her work ethic was unmatched. She maintained the house immaculately and ran errands without a word of complaint. Mary had filled that empty space. Jessica had begun to think of her as the daughter she never had, someone she could help, someone she could share her life with. But it had all been a lie. The betrayal stung deeper than any knife wound. A year had passed since Mary started working for her. At first, everything was perfect. But a few months ago, things started to change. Small amounts of money went missing. Nothing major, but enough for Jessica to notice. Occasionally, small items around the house would disappear. a piece of jewelry here, an old phone there. They were things Jessica could easily afford to replace, so she didn't dwell on them. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Mary, the once humble and obedient girl, was far more complex than Jessica had realized. Beneath her quiet, grateful facade was a woman who had grown up with less, always aware of what she didn't have. She had learned to mask her desires, to present herself as docile and unthreatening. Then there was Femi, the estate security guard who had taken a liking to Mary. Femi was charming, but in a dangerous, smooth-talking way. He was the kind of man who could convince you the sun was shining even when it rained. His easy smile and air of confidence had captivated Mary, and soon enough, he was feeding her fantasies of a better life, one that didn't involve serving someone else. Femi had no qualms about bending the rules to get what he wanted, and his ambitions were infectious. Jessica had caught them talking on several occasions, but Mary always brushed it off as harmless. It wasn't until later that Jessica realized they were plotting against her. Mary had been stealing small things and hiding them with Femi, planning to elope with him once they had taken enough. The day Jessica came home with the cash, the dollars she had withdrawn for her upcoming trip, was when everything spiraled out of control. Mary had found the money while cleaning her room and called Femi immediately. That night, Femi came over, and together they planned to steal the money and leave. But Jessica had caught them in the act. She remembered confronting them, her voice shaky but firm. Femi had reacted first, hitting her in the head with something hard, a hammer she realized now. She had fallen to the floor, dazed, her vision blurring. But it wasn't over. As she lay there, trying to get up, she saw Femi hand Mary a knife. The girl she had trusted, the girl she had treated like a daughter, had plunged the blade into her stomach without hesitation. And now here she was, left to die in her own home, abandoned by the very person she had tried to help. With a groan of effort, Madame Jessica dragged herself across the floor, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through her body. The pain was almost unbearable, but she wouldn't give up. Not like this. She had survived worse in her life, her marriage, the betrayal of her husband. She could survive this too. It felt like hours before she reached the front door, her bloodied fingers fumbling with the latch. She collapsed against the cool metal, the night air hitting her like a shock. Just as her vision started to fade, she saw headlights in the distance. A car was approaching. She could hear the muffled sound of voices, young men returning from a night out. "Oh my God," one of them shouted. "Call the police. She's hurt badly." The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was the frantic sound of someone dialing a phone. When she awoke, it was in the sterile brightness of a hospital room. Her body ached all over, but she was alive. The doctors had told her later that she had been found just in time and that the boys who had called the ambulance had likely saved her life. But Madame Jessica's mind was elsewhere, processing the deep betrayal that had led her here. Her son had flown in as soon as he heard. He sat beside her bed, his hand wrapped around hers, his face etched with concern. "I came as soon as I heard, Mom," he said softly, his voice tight with emotion. He had always been her strength, her pride, but even he couldn't take away the pain that gnawed at her heart. The police investigation moved swiftly. They had put out a notice for Mary and Femi, and within days, they were tracked down. Femi had sold Madame Jessica's car to a buyer in a neighboring town, but the police traced it back to them. When they were arrested, more shocking details came to light. Femi had lied to Mary, telling her that the car had been stolen by robbers on his way to sell it, pocketing the full amount himself. He had also kept most of the money they had stolen from Madame Jessica, cheating Mary out of her share. During their arrest, Mary broke down in tears. She confessed everything, her face pale with regret. I didn't want to hurt her, she whispered. She was so kind to me. I don't know why I did it, but it was too late for regret. The damage had been done. Madam Jessica listened as the police recounted the details of their capture. She felt hollow emptiness inside her chest. She had given Mary so much, her trust, her kindness, her generosity. And in return, Mary had almost taken her life. Her son squeezed her hand, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions swirling within her. "You'll get through this, Mom," he said quietly. "You're strong. You've always been strong."